these truths to be self-evident.
That all men are created equal.
As a member of Congress, I get to have a lot of really interesting people in the office, experts on what they're talking about.
This is the podcast
for insights into the issues.
China, bioterrorism, Medicare for all, in-depth discussions.
Breaking it down into simple terms. We hold
these truths. We hold these truths.
With Dan Crenshaw.
The Eagle has landed.
Welcome back, folks. So today I want to talk about our public health institutions. There's some concerning data out there that indicates that people have lost a lot of trust in institutions like our CDC or FDA, public health officials in general, and that's largely due to COVID, largely due to a number of reasons that I want to get into today. Lack of transparency, pushing of narratives that were, kind of clearly questionable or at least debatable. But I think public health officials acted like they were, acted with 100% certainty, especially regarding COVID. Maybe it was therapeutics, maybe it was vaccines, maybe it was the nature of the risk, whatever it was. And of course, more recently, what's made a lot of headlines is the COVID origins, and the report that came out that maybe not a smoking gun, but pretty definitively indicated it was a lab leak, and that theory wasn't as crazy as Twitter fact checkers made it out to be. I also want to get into, and maybe this doesn't interest as many people. It's not as hot of a topic, but I think it's more important to you than you realize. FDA approval processes. What does it take to get drugs to market? Why are drug prices so high compared to other countries? What causes that? What kind of drugs are really responsible for the highest prices that we see and the most costs in the market? I think all of this is really interesting. And also, so does my guest, which is he's a returning guest, very, I think, prominent healthcare professional and Dr. Scott Gottlieb. He was the FDA Commissioner under President Trump. You saw him on the news a lot. He was a big leader in the early parts of COVID under President Trump. Always on TV. I think giving a well-reasoned, nuanced, intelligent view of what was going on. He's a AEI now, has been for many years. He's got a long glowing record in public health, and I think is a very clear voice on all of these issues that we want to talk about. Scott, thanks so much for being on again.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for having me.
So, geez, where do we begin? So that was my intro there. Maybe we'll start with a piece we've written semi-recently about how to make the CDC better. Now, you ran the FDA. Maybe actually give people a quick 101. What is the FDA supposed to do? What is the CDC supposed to do? Which also gets into your op-ed you wrote recently on how to fix the CDC, and maybe getting it back to what it's actually supposed to do.
Yeah, well, FDA has direct regulatory authority to oversee the safety and effectiveness of different products. So the most obvious is medical products, drugs, medical devices, biologicals. It oversees the safety of the blood supply. It also regulates food. When there's a determination made that there's an outbreak of illness that's tied to food, FDA will go in and find the food source and oversees the facilities that manufacture food or some of the farms that grow food to make sure that they're doing it in ways that don't create conditions where people can get harmed by contaminants. It oversees animal drugs, and it also regulates tobacco. Those are the prominent areas, but there's a lot of other smaller product areas that FDA oversees. CDC is primarily in the business of developing information to help inform regulatory decision making and to help inform the application of general public health. So things like trends in disease outbreaks or trends in chronic diseases that can be used by public health agencies in cities and states, as well as regulatory authorities like FDA, to set policy. That's primarily what CDC does. It has some direct authority to oversee certain areas. For example, it administers the quarantine rule when there's an outbreak of illness where individuals might need to be quarantined, say, in a ship that's coming into the United States. But by and large, what the CDC does is develop information to help guide decision making and doesn't directly regulate products. But FDA and CDC, I think to your point, have a lot of sort of not overlapping jurisdiction, but overlapping roles, where CDC is often in the position of developing information that then helps guide FDA decision making. And that handoff between CDC and FDA has been challenging in the past, and it was challenging when I was at FDA, and I think it remains so.
Well, yeah, and you noted some examples like anti-smoking programs within the CDC. There was another example I thought was interesting, but yeah, I think even your common layman can be like, does that really belong in the Center for Disease Control? I mean, how many times anti-gun activists have asked me to, why won't you just support a study from the CDC to study gun violence? And I'm like, even if I thought we didn't have enough information on gun violence, which I don't think, I think we have plenty of information on that. Why would it be in the CDC? It's like we want to keep piling on missions within this one particular bureaucracy. I'm not even sure how big the CDC is. How many people does it even have? And is it really appropriate to be putting all of these different mission sets within it?
Yeah, what we've seen is a lot of mission creep over the CDC, and the mission creep has been in its disease prevention role. So if you go back to the inception of CDC, it was thought of as sort of a national security agency. It was thought of in the context of our national security, and it was really focused on its disease control mission. Going in, trying to find outbreaks of illness happening both in the United States and outside the United States, and trying to take measures to prevent the spread of communicable disease here in the United States. And so, people think of the CDC, they think of people going in with spacesuits into an outbreak of Ebola in West Africa and trying to find the cause. What's happened over time is it started to get involved in what I would call the softer side of epidemiology, the disease prevention role, doing things like trying to reduce the harms from smoking, trying to prevent heart disease. You talk about gun control, and the CDC has gotten involved in trying to do studies in the past to reduce gun violence. These aren't necessarily things that the CDC ought to be doing. There's other agencies in the government that have direct regulatory authority over these areas. Smoking's an obvious one, where the FDA directly regulates tobacco products. So why is the CDC in the business of developing information that's supposed to help guide regulatory decision-making when they don't have any of the regulatory authority? And the handoff between CDC and FDA around those areas isn't fluid. I'll give you sort of one example. Back in 2017, 2018, during the flu season, it was the fall. I was new at FDA, so I was the incoming commissioner. I'd only been in a job about 4 months, and we were very worried that year that it was going to be a particularly bad flu season. We thought that there was a mismatch between the vaccine that had been developed and the prevalent strain of flu that was circulating that season. And we wanted to warn the public. We wanted to warn providers and patients to be more vigilant and tell doctors that if they do have patients coming in with the flu, even if they've been vaccinated, if they're at risk, you ought to think about early interventions like treating a patient with Tamiflu if you think they're at risk for a bad outcome from the flu, because the vaccine may not be covering as well. And we were right about that. The vaccine was not a good match for the flu strain that season. I developed a public health advisory that we were ready to issue, and we were about to go out with it. And CDC blocked me. They actually went to the Secretary of Health and Human Services to block me from putting out the public health advisory, because they said, we're in charge of talking about the severity of the flu, not FDA, and we're not ready to make a conclusion yet about the severity of this year's flu season. So what I did was change the public health advisory to an update to the product label of the vaccine, because we regulate the product label, FDA does, and they can't do anything about any information that I incorporate into the vaccine's product label. And we put it out that way. So we got our information out. But CDC ultimately didn't come to a conclusion about the severity of the flu season until the following summer, when they basically came out with a report in their journal, the Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report, saying, it was an unusually bad flu season that year. So
after they had all the data.
They had all the data. They couldn't make a timely determination. They waited until it wasn't really actionable. And worse than that, they actually intervened to block us from speaking to it when we were in a position to have a pretty good view on what was going on, given the FDA's closeness to the vaccines and the fact that they collect real-time information about the vaccine's performance in the marketplace. So that's the kind of mindset. The problem is, I'll just sort of pause here, but it's a very academic culture at CDC. Yeah. It's sort of like an academic institution and not really an organization that does
action oriented.
Action. Yeah, exactly.
When people exactly, and you're exactly right. People view the CDC as the movie Outbreak, right? What was Dustin Hoffman? Am I getting that right? That was no, not Dustin Hoffman. He looks like Dustin Hoffman. You know what I'm talking about. It was the monkey. They almost bombed it. It was Cuba Gooding Jr. was the pilot.
Well, that was a Dustin Hoffman movie, but
it was. Am I crazy? Yeah. Anyway, that's how people view it, right? Like, okay, there's an outbreak and all these professionals come in and they set up these tents and whatever. And I don't know if it's really like that. I don't even know if that capability actually exists, or who runs that. But that's certainly how people view it, as at least as an operational arm, the Center for Disease Control, not some academic institution. It's like we have plenty of academic institutions, and academic institutions don't like to come out with super timely research. They like to be right, and so they're going to wait until maybe it's too late. And so, yeah, it gets to the question of, okay, so that example, I mean, what does that tell you about what's wrong with the CDC? And you kind of answered, I suppose. It's become too academic. And so how do you fix that?
Well, partly you got to change the culture of the organization. And historically, it's been a culture that's favored academic publications over direct action. And that's ingrained in the culture of the organization. So, for example, with my flu example, they waited until they were able to publish their findings in an academic journal rather than come out with the information in the form of a public health advisory. So that's a cultural change that the institution needs to undergo. But I think one of the ways to start changing the culture is to focus it back on its disease control mission and move some of the prevention work that it does, or the support work that it does for local public health departments, out of that agency. So, for example, they do a lot to support tribal health, but we have an Indian health service that also has people on the ground engaging those activities. So why is CDC in the business of spending literally hundreds of millions of dollars doing analysis of tribal health related issues when that money could be probably better spent, I think, by the Indian Health Service, where they actually have boots on the ground. They have providers in communities, so they're closer to the provision of healthcare and better able, I think, to target the kinds of research that needs to get done to inform the delivery of care. That happens across the CDC's book of business. So, for example, they also spend hundreds of millions of dollars developing research around the scope of the opioid epidemic. But again, we have an agency, SAMHSA, which is focused on developing programs to try to mitigate the impact of opioids. That money might be better spent by agencies that actually have direct authority to try to mitigate the problem. So wherever there's an instance where the CDC is in the business of spending a lot of money developing academic literature and studies and findings to try to inform action that can mitigate a public health problem, if there's an agency actually in the trenches, I think the money may be better spent within those agencies and focus the CDC back on the Dustin Hoffman movie, which is the epidemiological surveillance portion of the CDC, where people actually engage in disease control activities, both here in the United States as well as outside the US.
They should probably not use the term surveillance. just as a public relations dual, just because of what's happened over the last few years, which I want to get to. But adding on to what you just said, so there's just a couple of things happening there that I think annoy your common American citizen. One is the overlap of government agencies, and now I'm dealing with Democrats. The charge is always, we're not doing anything, and I'm like, well, there's actually 16 programs that do exactly that. Don't act like we're not doing anything just because Republicans want to get rid of this one thing. And of course, that's always that's the political side of why there's so much overlap and why it's so hard to claw back. But then I think what also annoys people is spending hundreds of $millions of dollars on fighting smoking. Like, how many more studies do we need on smoking or obesity? Who the heck came up with this food pyramid that has basically been making people fat for God knows how many decades? It doesn't work. Cereal is not a healthy food. And this gets to the first, I don't know, question or statement I made at the beginning of this podcast, which is this decline in public trust from these institutions. And are they doing a good job tying these studies on whether it's health outcomes in tribal communities or smoking or obesity, whatever, or and especially the opioid epidemic? Is there any outcomes that they're tying it to? Is there any metrics? Like, all of these hundreds of millions of dollars spent studying it, I'm like, what is there to study? Don't take too much opioids. Like, I'm not a doctor, but I'm pretty sure that's the cause. Don't take so much opioids.
Yeah.
I don't know. It drives a lot of people crazy.
So I'll give you an example with smoking. So FDA regulates tobacco. I was at the agency when we were dealing with a sharp uptick in youth use of e-cigarettes. CDC was in charge of doing a survey looking at youth use of e-cigarettes. So FDA actually contracted with CDC, and CDC would conduct the survey on tobacco use among children. And they were the ones who came up with the data showing a very sharp uptick of e-cigarette use among children. back in 2018. So when I first got wind of that data, I got the top line data from CDC. I wanted to go out immediately and talk about this as an emerging public health problem. CDC wouldn't give me the bottom line data. I had to effectively coerce it out of them by writing an op-ed jointly with the Secretary of Health and Human Services. And once he got involved, then CDC had to make it available to him because they didn't want to give it to me. So they had no real obligation or sense of obligation that they had to make a timely disclosure of the information once it was available. Then I wanted to know, well, if kids are using e-cigarettes, what e-cigarettes are they using? Because we knew it was probably certain brands that kids were finding fashionable. And it was a real battle to get CDC to put in the following year's survey an actual question on, well, if you use e-cigarettes, which e-cigarette are you using? And that was very important from a regulatory standpoint. And the underlying problem here is what we said at the outset, which is CDC doesn't regulate tobacco. They're not responsible for taking action based on their information. So they're more focused on getting it all aggregated, trying to publish it in a journal. And they do careful work. They do good research work insofar as what they do, but they're not on the hook for trying to follow through on that to actually affect a public health goal, whereas I was at FDA. So I had different needs. So if I was in the business of collecting the information, we would have done the survey differently in a way that the information could have been actionable to actually drive to what people wanted to affect, which was they wanted the FDA to take steps to try to reduce e-cigarette use among children. CDC wasn't in the business of trying to implement that goal, so they weren't designing their research in a way that it was
interesting.
actionable.
That's really interesting. It's kind of like a bad poll, being in the political world. If you ask a poll the wrong way, it might be interesting as a thought experiment, but it's not interesting if you're trying to actually affect change and get relevant data from people.
So I'll give you a COVID example while we're on the topic of a bad poll. With CDC. CDC did a survey in the summer of 2020. So, this was after we had information that COVID wasn't really spreading outdoors in the same way it was spreading in indoors confined spaces. And they basically did a survey where they went to people who got COVID and they interviewed them and tried to discern what those individuals did in the last 10 days. So where were they where they could have contracted COVID? And what they found was that people who ate out, so they ate out at a restaurant, were far more likely to report that they came down with COVID. So the headline from their study was that dining is correlated with contracting COVID. In the survey, it was the summertime, mind you, and in the survey, they didn't ask if you ate indoors or outdoors. So that's a critical question, right? That's really going to inform behaviors. And then the other thing they did in the survey is they lumped bars with coffee shops. And so when I went to them, I said, why are you grouping bars with coffee shops? They said, well, they're similar activities in our view. Now, I don't think they're similar activities. People engage in different kinds of behaviors. It might linger longer in a bar, might be a more confined setting, but it's certainly something that you should tease apart. And they failed to do it. Again, because they're not thinking of what would the action be? What would you be recommending consumers do? They're not action oriented. And so they don't conceive the studies in a mindset of trying to affect some public health goal like that.
So is that just bad leadership? Because that's just common sense. I mean, I you don't need to be a doctor or a disease specialist to properly tease out that data. I just remember that time and how frustrated our American citizens were because everyone else is smart enough to figure out, to ask those questions that you just asked. Well, what about outdoor dining? And why are we closing down beaches and parks? Like there was not that many people who truly, well, that's not true. I mean, I still see people in Washington, D.C. wearing masks in parks. It's more rare now, but it still does happen. So obviously some of those people do exist. But it just seems common sense. So who was in charge? It seems like you didn't have a great relationship with the CDC when you were head of FDA. Who was in charge of CDC at the time?
Well, there was a director initially. She left, and Bob Redfield was the director of CDC. Okay. But these things happened at a staff level. I mean, there were times when I called the CDC director to try to work our way through a particularly thorny issue. Yeah. But most of the time, these kinds of things happened at a lower level. Yeah,
because Redfield seemed pretty competent.
Redfield was good to work with. I mean, the place where probably him and I worked together the most was when it came to issues around food safety. Because here again, CDC. So the way food safety works in this country is if there's an outbreak of illness, let's say in some county, CDC will go in and investigate that outbreak. And once they make a determination that the outbreak is linked to a food, something people ate, then they'll hand it off to FDA, and it'll be FDA's job to isolate the particular food source and then take whatever action is necessary. So, for example, recalling a food product. But very often when you have an outbreak of illness, you know right away it's going to be a food source. And oftentimes you know which food source is going to be. Even though the investigation might not be done, you don't have a definitive conclusion. You have a pretty good sense. And so in those instances, I felt we had an obligation to go out with early information and say, we've identified an outbreak of illness. We believe it's going to be related to, leafy green vegetables, and these leafy green vegetables in particular. And, we're urging consumers to be cautious or something like that. CDC actually blocked us, again, stepped in to try to stop us from making those kinds of communications. And ultimately we negotiated a compromise where jointly we would go out with earlier communications around outbreaks of illness. That happened at a senior level. So there were instances where we negotiated changes in sort of the handoff between the two agencies. But that and the other examples I gave you is what goes on. That's the tension between CDC and other agencies. And, I come back to the point of, if you focus them back on the disease control mission, you don't have them wading into all these other areas. You don't have them doing smoking cessation. You don't have them doing vaccine safety. FDA regulates vaccines in the post-market setting. They collect information. So why are both institutions engaged in trying to collect information like around the flu vaccine and make conclusions around whether or not the vaccine works well against a particular strain in a particular season? That's something FDA can handle. It already is in that business, and it also is in the business of trying to then actually affect outcomes, inform consumers and providers of what to do with the information.
I want to talk about, there's so many examples, but, let's go back in time a little bit to the days of 2020. And this COVID is ravaging the world. And you got Dr. Fauci out there on TV every day. I'm kind of curious why he ended up in that administration being the main spokesperson. Does the CDC, I should know this, but well, you know what, I do know it, but I'm just asking for the audience's sake. The CDC and FDA fall under NIH?
They fall under HHS. Okay, so NIH, CDC, and FDA all, as you know, fall under HHS, all report up to the secretary.
But why was Fauci always kind of front and center on this issue? It seems like, did it just sort of happen that way? Did Trump initially trust him the most? I actually don't know how he became.
I had left the administration in 2019. So I left in the summer of 2019. So I wasn't in the administration when COVID happened. But my perception was that they just saw him as an articulate spokesperson. And remember, Tony Fauci had also been point during the H1N1 swine flu outbreak, where he had spoken to that issue. He had also been very active in the Bush administration back in 2005, and I was in the Bush administration at the time working on this issue when we were very worried that there was going to be an outbreak of bird flu. Tony Fauci was the guy that the administration had put out to speak to those risks. So I think he had experience speaking to the public around these kinds of issues and was just perceived as someone who can articulate a message effectively. So he was the guy on the podium.
Yeah, and look, people's frustration comes from, I think, the CDC and the administration, probably mostly the CDC and certainly Fauci, defending things that I think had been widely, not debunked, but very clearly debatable things, like putting masks on kids, shutting down schools, continuing to defend lockdowns, even after I think it was well established that they didn't really have an effect of the way they initially thought. One thing I always got frustrated with hearing Dr. Fauci speak was he would sound so definitive, saying, "Look, your kids could die." He would say something like that, and it would be so definitive, so absolutist. Like, yes, your kid could die, but he fails to mention, the probability of that happening. And it seemed very obvious to the public that that data and facts were being decontextualized in order to promote and push for certain behaviors that they wanted from the public, right? This kind of excessive caution or safety. as well-intentioned as that may have been, it really made people mad, and the institutions have clearly not recovered.
Yeah, and look, I think you're right that there's now a secular change in how people perceive public health generally and public health officials, and there's going to be a lot of distrust, and this is a generational thing. I think we're going to be grappling with this as public health officials, physicians, people who are engaged in this enterprise are going to be grappling with this for a long time, and it's earned. I think from my standpoint, people didn't show enough humility during the COVID crisis on what we didn't know. And that was in part born of a belief among some, and I didn't hold this view, but among some, that if you go out with a more nuanced message, if you say, we think masks can be effective, we're not sure how effective, if you show uncertainty, then you're going to discourage people from engaging in the kind of collective action that you want them to do. And my view is, and I grappled with this a lot when I was at FDA, that you can go out with a nuanced message if you do it well, and people will understand what you're communicating, and they'll be able to calibrate the risk for themselves. That you don't have to be sort of absolute, right, black and white. You can inject some uncertainty. And then the second part of that was, as the information accrued, as we learned more about what was and wasn't working, they didn't update the message. They were reluctant to then say, well, we were wrong or we were right, but we were wrong about this aspect. And masks is a good example. So, early on they said masks wouldn't work. Then they said masks would work. But they didn't talk about the mask quality being an important factor. So if this was like the flu and it was spread primarily through droplet transmission, a lower quality mask would afford you some measure of protection. But once we learned that COVID was airborne, a regular procedure mask, and certainly a cloth mask, wasn't going to be effective at protecting an individual. And I wrote about this in the Wall Street Journal during the summer 2020, that mask quality matters. At that point, if you wanted to protect yourself, if you were someone who was at high risk and you wanted to wear a mask to protect yourself, you had to wear a high quality mask because it was airborne, and a low quality mask wasn't going to work. And they didn't update that message. It took them a very long time. You started to see some governors do it, but the federal government didn't. And the problem was there were people who could have benefited from a high quality mask, who might have been older individuals who were immunocompromised, and they didn't know that it was important to wear a high quality mask to protect themselves. So they thought they were getting protection from a procedure mask, and they weren't. And frankly, there probably were people who exposed themselves to the virus and might have gotten it wearing a low quality mask, thinking that they were being protected when they weren't. And that's an example where we had to update the message. If the guidance was that masks were going to afford you a measure of protection, and we can debate how much protection you're going to derive from a mask, but a high quality mask protects you from a respiratory pathogen. That's why when I used to take care of patients with tuberculosis, I'd wear an N95 mask. I never got tuberculosis taking care of those patients because I was protected with a well-fitting mask. But we didn't change the guidance. We didn't update it as we learned more, and we didn't go out with a more nuanced message that if you wanted to be protected through one-way masking, it was important to be wearing a high-quality mask.
It's one of many. And lockdowns, I think, are another one. Now, the U.S. largely grew out of the whole lockdown obsession, even in Democrat counties and states. I couldn't give you a date, but it especially when I compare it to other countries like Europe and even more recently even China. So that was, I guess, good. But at the same time, I think the benefit of lockdowns had been debunked by the data well before the obsession. We grew out of the obsession with lockdowns. That was really frustrating to people too, because I think for the basic reason that most common sense Americans can say, look, if I want to be locked down, I can lock myself down. If I want to avoid other people, I have the ability as a human being to just avoid other people or wear a mask or put a bubble on my head or whatever it is. And this gets to just like I think a basic philosophy of governance. Like, do people have the right to keep themselves safe, or are they so stupid that you have to do it for them? And I always tell people, I'm like, look, I can take this logic to its extreme. I can put you in jail, I can feed you and clothe you, and I promise you'll be safe and you'll have zero freedom. But that's, of course, no life at all. And that seemed to be to the point where we were getting, where it was like the safety at any cost. And safety at any cost, I mean, that phrase, I think, is important for FDA regulation. It's important for how we deal with the disease. It's important for how we regulate literally anything. And sometimes we just go way overboard. And I think that what I want, the only reason I still even want to have this conversation, because I'm so sick of having it, frankly, over the last few years, I'm sure you are too, is because I just want to make sure we don't make those same mistakes again. Right? This lack of transparency, this absolutism in our messaging, this need, this is like, it's like public relations 101 teaches people you've always got to have a definitive message, but you also have to have the judgment to understand when that definitive message might be counterproductive, and a little bit of nuance and a little bit of, you know what, we don't know. So this is what we do know, and you can make your own decisions. That's okay too. And then admitting mistakes so that we don't make them again. I swear, and you could maybe correct me on this, wasn't this the CDC already had guidance, like published guidance well before COVID happened on influenza type outbreaks, airborne illnesses outbreaks. And what was not in there was masks and lockdowns. None of that was ever in there. And yet it became the policy almost because we needed to tell the public to do something. And I think and so we've lost a lot of trust as a result. The other infuriating thing, the last thing I'll list here, was it was very clear very, very early on how this disease affected old people versus young people. And I think that the school lockdowns, the teachers unions demanding school lockdowns, was so beyond the pale of a disservice to the public that I think it remains unforgivable, and it's not something I want people to forget about either.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the decisions we made around children in schools was probably the single most regrettable and biggest policy mistake that we made looking back with hindsight. And it was something that was apparent at the time, and certainly apparent early enough that you could have changed policy. I think even after we had shut down schools during the initial spring outbreak back in March, it was very clear that you could reopen the schools. And there were a lot of folks, including myself, talking about trying to reopen schools to get kids back in the classroom before the summer break. And for schools that didn't do that, it was abundantly clear that you were able to do that in the fall. And a lot of states did. My state did. My kids were back in public school, but a lot of states didn't. I think in terms of just the policies generally, I think that there was even a more fundamental mistake than just the mistakes we made in the policy judgment. Early on, we didn't clearly define what the goals were and then stick to them. So if the goal, you remember, the 15 days to slow the spread was because we saw really New York City's healthcare system collapsed. And I was there. I trained in New York City, and it became a COVID-only healthcare system for about a month. And I think a lot of folks in policy making, and I was talking to the White House at this time, looked at that and they said, and I remember this quote, I put it in my book, someone very senior said to me, we can't sustain another New York. We won't be able to give another city the New York treatment. And that was the direct line that stuck with me. And what they were saying was, we won't be able to backstop another city. So a lot of the early policy was driven by trying to slow the spread, to buy some time, to backstop other cities if you have big outbreaks in other cities. If that was the goal, it should have been a short-term intervention. But we never clearly articulated what the goal was. And so the goal kept moving. And, suddenly all these policies that we implemented, which were supposed to be for a week or two, became policies just to try to mitigate spread generally, when we weren't going to be able to do that through those kinds of interventions. And so as an example, I think also of not articulating what we were trying to achieve, and in allowing the goalposts to continually get moved. Yeah,
that's true as well. But yeah, and I remember thinking about that a lot. Is the goal just no more spread, right? China articulated that goal pretty well recently, and it didn't turn out well for them. It's impossible.
That's what it became, right? Yeah. I mean, that's what it became. Just use these interventions, which came at an extreme cost, to just reduce spread generally, rather than initially, at least the way it was articulated at the outset, it was to try to buy us some time, slow the spread so we can get testing in place, get better interventions in place to help, treat people who might become ill, and as well as diagnose it.
Well, actually, okay, so that actually reminds me, I want to focus on the FDA's problems too, or at least the criticisms, one surrounding testing, and one surrounding interventions or therapeutics for COVID.
Yeah, look, one of the big challenges we had at the outset of this was we didn't have testing in place. And so I think that was the root of a lot of the policy mistakes that we made, because not only didn't we know where the virus was spreading, but we didn't know where it wasn't spreading. And if we had testing in place, we would have been able to we would have known up front that this was a highly regional outbreak. And that's the way it's been all through the pandemic for the last 3 years. You see new strains become prevalent in certain parts of the country and then slowly spread across the country. And that's the way the flu season materializes each year. We didn't need to shut down the whole country. We didn't need to do the 15 days to slow the spread across the whole country, because there were parts of the country that were largely unaffected by this early on. And if we had diagnostics in place, we could have targeted those interventions. When you look back at the pandemic plan from 2005, the plan that the HHS wrote, the Bush administration wrote, it contemplated what we call non-pharmaceutical interventions. It contemplated using what we called in that plan snow days, where you'd ask people to stay at home for 2 or 3 days, certainly not weeks and months, but 2 or 3 days, one replication cycle of the virus to give yourself time to deploy vaccines. But it contemplated using those measures, those non-pharmaceutical interventions, when it became obvious based on testing that there was an outbreak of an illness in a particular city, that it was already epidemic, not shutting down preemptively. So the lack of a diagnostic test, I think, was the root of a lot of our policy mistakes. Why didn't we have a test? Well, CDC famously botched the development of a test. So we should never have been in the hands of CDC. They should have outsourced the development and deployment of a test like South Korea did. But then FDA also made a decision early on to prevent academic health centers from deploying their own what we call laboratory developed tests. And that could have been an early stopgap, allowing academic institutions to manufacture and deploy their own tests. It could have been a way to get more testing into the marketplace. And that just didn't happen. It eventually happened, but during that critical month of March, it didn't happen. So that was a policy mistake. Now, in hindsight, I think FDA has made some really good decisions, albeit belatedly, by allowing these at-home tests. If you would have asked me 5-6 years ago, will FDA ever allow patients to have a test at home where they can self-diagnose for a communicable disease, I would have said there's no way the agency, the regulators, are going to get comfortable with that, because they believe that patients shouldn't be able to self-diagnose out of a medical setting, out of the supervision of a doctor, or else they're going to make bad decisions. They're not going to get in the hands of a provider where they can get medical care, where they can get treatment. So you have to make sure that happens within a supervised medical setting. And that was a very paternalistic view by the agency. But they really have come full circle. And now they're allowing tests, not just for COVID, but for flu. And you're going to see a whole bunch of tests come into the market where all of a sudden we're going to be able to self-diagnose at home for things that we used to have to go into our doctor's office. So the agency has course corrected. They just didn't have the right policies in place at the outset of this pandemic. And it was a critical shortcoming. It really hurt us in the beginning.
Well, what's the deal with the antibodies now, the monoclonal antibody treatment? I was reading it's now that approval has been retracted. It's no longer, because they say it's no longer effective for certain new variations of COVID. What's going on with that?
Yeah, so the antibodies are developed to target the spike protein on the virus, and as the virus mutates and changes the conformation of the spike protein, the antibodies are no longer effective. In the same way that the vaccine has lost its effectiveness as the virus has mutated and had to be updated, the agency makes that determination that the antibodies are no longer effective on what we call immunogenicity studies. So they don't wait and look for clinical data from patients to say, well, the antibody is not working as well in patients as it used to. What they do is rely on laboratory studies where they test whether or not the antibody drug is able to neutralize the new version of the virus. And that's a standard approach. We do that in other settings for antibodies against other viruses, and it's pretty reliable. The laboratory testing is a pretty good proxy for how the antibodies are going to perform in the real world in actual patients. I think that the challenge here, and the problem, if you will, is that they don't rely on the same construct to approve new antibodies. So if the company that makes one of the antibodies, Regeneron, said, okay, you took my antibody off the market because the laboratory studies show that it no longer neutralizes this version of the virus, I've now developed a new antibody. I've changed it a little bit. I haven't changed the sort of structure of my drug, but I've changed the spike protein that the antibody is going to target to match the new strain of the virus. Will you approve it based on the same immunogenicity studies? FDA will turn around and say, oh no, we need clinical outcome studies. We need you to enroll a fully randomized clinical trial and prove that this new drug, this new version of the antibody, actually helps prevent the disease in people, even though we know you've only made a small change to it, and that change should get around the problem of the mutation that the virus has undergone. So it's a construct that only works in one direction. It works to take the drugs off the market, but not to put them on the market. And I think if we're going to have a paradigm where we're able to have continuously updated antibodies and keep up with the virus as it mutates, we have to have a regulatory framework that allows those drugs to come to the market based just on that laboratory testing and maybe some complemented clinical data, but not a new outcome study every time. And that's what they're requiring. And that's why no companies are now developing new antibodies against these new versions of the virus. And there are no effective antibodies, with the exception perhaps of one, which the FDA doesn't recognize right now, that are available to patients who need them. And these drugs, just final point here, these drugs could be really important because they can work not just as a treatment and not just for patients who maybe are contraindicated for the oral pill or pills. There's 2 pills in the market, but they can also be used as a prophylaxis. So they could basically be used as a passive vaccine where you can infuse someone with the antibody and it'll hang around for 2 or 3 months and provide them constant protection against the virus. And so someone who doesn't want to get vaccinated, or someone for whom the vaccine isn't going to be very effective, they might be immunocompromised, they might be on chemotherapy. These antibodies could be very effective as basically what we would call passive vaccine, as a prophylaxis, and you just don't have them available now.
And that's a great example, but that example could be fleshed out or replicated many times. Forget about COVID treatments. It seems like it's replicated all the time, where I hear from especially these small biotech startups, they have a device or a treatment, even something very simple, that they just cannot get approved by the FDA, or the FDA keeps coming back and saying, well, we need a different kind of study. We need another study. We didn't like this piece of paperwork, and they don't communicate well. And the end result here, well, you just noted one result, which is these companies just don't even want to bother. So they don't even want to bother making these antibodies, which could save lives, because the regulatory burden, the approval burden is just too high, unnecessarily so. It's deeply frustrating to me because, again, I'm not a medical professional, but I do have common sense. And some of the hurdles that FDA requires of companies are impossible to make, even though it's so obviously safe.
Yeah, look, I think it's variable across the agency. I think that there are parts of the agency that are more forward-looking, more constructive, and more likely to innovate the regulatory requirements based on practical learnings in the marketplace. And so, with the example of the monoclonal antibodies, it's not that the companies don't bother. They literally can't do it. I mean, if you designed a new antibody against a new variant, and then you had to do a clinical outcome study, by the time you got that antibody onto the market and enrolled the study, which would be hard to do right now because it's harder to enroll COVID studies. People, the pool of people who are going to enroll in these studies who are really concerned about COVID has shrunk over time as people have built up immunity from both vaccination as well as getting the virus. Sure. If you had to do that study, by the time you got the antibody to the market, we'd be on to the next variant. So it's just not practical. The vaccine side of FDA's house actually is using that construct to get new versions of the vaccine on the market. So the reason why the new bivalent vaccine came to market without a big outcome study. So the first vaccine was approved on the basis of a very large randomized outcome study in 45,000 patients for each of the vaccines, where they actually randomized patients to the vaccine and placebo and saw if the placebo group got COVID at a higher rate than the people who had gotten the vaccine. That's a very big outcome study. It's one of the biggest outcome studies ever conducted. The new vaccines, so the updates to the vaccines, the FDA is making those updates as long as you don't change the vaccine, the structure of the vaccine, based on immunogenicity studies, based on being able to show that the vaccine induces the production of antibodies in a person that neutralize the new variant. Because if you had to replicate the outcome study, you'd never have the vaccine in time to protect against that new variant. And this is how we update flu vaccines each year. We don't do outcome studies each year. We rely on immunogenicity data, basically proving that the vaccine can produce antibodies that go on to neutralize the new strain of the virus. So the vaccine side of the house recognized this construct and incorporated it over time. It took them time. It took them 2 years to do it. They had to get comfort that these studies from the test tubes correlated with outcomes in people. But after multiple times of having randomized studies, they got comfortable with that fact. But the drug side of the house won't. So it's an example where there's sort of a dichotomy in FDA. The same basic principle is being applied in one setting, but not being applied in another. And either the principle is true or it's not. I'm confident it's true that these test tube studies do correlate with clinical benefit, but you should apply it, consistently across the agency because it's sort of a law of biology, if you will.
Yeah, and it does seem like, again, I talk to companies all the time who are just frustrated by this. They're going to lose their investors. And these are, and I'm talking about really simple stuff. I'm going to give you an example here in a second. And there's a few problems that are highlighted here. Well, one is the FDA doesn't get back to them. People often tell me that their European regulators are much better, at least like, hey, this is what we need you to do. You follow these steps and you get approved. The FDA is like this. They almost don't want to give you the information. It's almost like a combative relationship as opposed to a partnership, which is deeply frustrating to the industry. And I'll give you this example. So I mean, because this is a local Houston company called Intuitap, and their device is really simple. It tries to solve the following problem, right? Spinal punctures. Whether it's an epidural needle or spinal tap, whatever, they can be inaccurate. You might take it, a lady's going into labor, it takes 4 times to get the needle in there because the doctor has to feel in the vertebrae and figure that out. You're obviously well aware. And anyone, and any woman who's listening who's gone through labor is probably very much aware of that as well. So this device just combines that spinal puncture with a technology called VeriTouch, which, by the way, has also already been separately approved, combines this into one device so that you basically hit it in the right spot every single time. And they've spent years trying to get this approved, multiple clinical trials and multiple dealings with the FDA where they're not really talking to the right people. The FDA is giving them a doctor who's not familiar with this particular technology or this particular specialty. It's the wrong kind of specialty. Again, I still don't understand it because this is just common sense to me. You're combining 2 technologies. It works very simple. This is a great case study, and I'm going to take this case study to our committee at some point soon this year and show it to everyone and say, look, this is a broken system. If the simplest of devices that any common sense layman can look at and say, this is fine, we should be using this. And like one of the hurdles they had was FDA said, well, your study didn't take into account potentially left-handed doctors. And you're like, are you serious right now? I mean, it's like, why do you say that ahead of time too? I mean, why wouldn't you give us that information ahead of time? And we could have asked for left-handed doctors, all 6 of them. I mean, it's like I don't know. I mean, it's just so absurd. It's like they're trying to screw with people. And and I also. Anyway, maybe you could talk about these kind of examples. I mean, do you hear about these examples often? You must.
Yeah, I mean, I would hear these things a lot. I think that different parts of the agency do a better job of providing a lot of sort of ongoing objective guidance to agencies on how to design clinical trials that are going to ultimately meet regulatory requirements. Because at the end of the day, you have to develop clinical data that could support the application, but also could satisfy regulators. That's the system we have. And so you want, to your point, you want the regulators to be very specific about what they think they're going to need to make a judgment about the product. Some parts of the agency are very good about that. During COVID, certain parts of the agency were very good about that. And that was a real innovation that came out of COVID. The agency was providing much more practical, real-time guidance to manufacturers as they were designing and implementing these clinical trials. On the medical device side of the house, sometimes it is hit or miss because you have very sort of specific groups focused on very discrete and narrow areas where there may be just one person who oversees an entire space or entire sort of paradigm of medical devices. And if that single person or the few people within that group don't engage as much with industry and different people do a better and worse job than this, then you're going to have companies that are in a situation perhaps of the company that you're talking about. When I was there, we tried to make it part of the expectation of the job of being a reviewer that you were going to engage externally, you were going to put out guidance, you were going to be communicative about what the requirements were. But like any organization, there's variable allegiance to those kinds of goals. With medical devices specifically, you're oftentimes, to get it approved or get it cleared by the FDA, oftentimes you're trying to demonstrate comparability to an existing medical device. You're trying to find a predicate medical device and then compare your product, your new medical device, to a predicate medical device. In areas where there's no predicate, there's nothing to compare it to because it's so highly novel, those are the areas that can be very difficult because then you're trying to design a clinical trial, sometimes what we call a de novo application, where you're doing it basically from scratch. There's nothing to compare your device to. So you're basically establishing the paradigm for how that device is going to be evaluated by the agency.
Yeah, and what's frustrating about this case is it's the opposite. It's basically combining two well-established
Existing, yeah.
predicates, and then they can't get it through. Anyway, it's a good case study for it, and I'm always scratching my head wondering, okay, what bill can I pass? Because I'm on the healthcare subcommittee on E&C. We directly oversee FDA. What bill can I pass to make this better? And it's not obvious to me. Maybe that's something we work together offline about. I bet you have some ideas.
I think there's in the PDUFA legislation. So when FDA reauthorizes PDUFA, you always see provisions that, the agency has to have a meeting early on. They have to provide written feedback. And I think all of that helps. But ultimately, requiring the agency to provide written feedback to questions isn't helpful if the answers that sponsors get aren't informative. And so I think Congress needs to focus not just on the mechanics of the process, where historically I think there's been a lot of focus, making sure that there's engagement at key points in the development process, but the quality of that engagement. And the agency needs to be measured by that. And there's ways to do that, to look back, to do reports, to analyze the quality of the information, to analyze whether or not sponsors feel the questions are really being answered. I think ultimately the agency needs to be accountable not just to providing feedback, timely feedback, but also providing feedback that's actually actionable. And again, some parts of the agency do it very well, but there's variable allegiance to these goals. And so you get situations where there's products and entire product areas where you have sponsors that are stymied because the regulatory rules of the road aren't clear to them.
No, they're not, and it tends to favor these larger companies that have relationships with FDA. Oftentimes maybe people who go work for the FDA were previously at your big pharma companies,
or the ability to hire a lot of consultants who can inform it, or the fact that they have multiple products that they're filing with the agency, so they might learn something from one interaction that informs another interaction. So you're right. Big companies are able to aggregate more information and get more insight into the process. And it does disadvantage small companies that don't have the same resources, who might just have a single product.
It does massively. And
who might be the most entrepreneurial and taking the biggest risks.
They are. And the big companies won't buy them up until they've got that FDA approval. Because most of these small companies just want to be bought, right? That's the whole point of the startup culture, and they can't get bought, even though so again, this example, like they want to be bought by, say, Johnson & Johnson, but Johnson & Johnson won't take that risk, even though Johnson & Johnson could probably get this through FDA much faster. Like they could probably get this done quicker. It shouldn't be, it shouldn't be so different for a big company versus large company. The process should be clear and concise, and the people who work at FDA should want to work with industry and get these things through. Because you can take one look at this stuff and be like, this is good. There's some things that are more complicated, right? There's some things that are more complicated, do deserve a lot more scrutiny. There's some things that are so damn obvious, again, like this example, where it should make the American public mad. It should make every woman who's going into labor upset that they can't get a device put in their hospital that would help them get that epidural much more accurately instead of doctor trying for it 4 times. And it's all just because some regulators are either too scared to do what's right, or don't care, or too busy. Maybe there's not enough of them. I don't know what the problem is, but it's something I want to certainly sort out. I want to move the conversation real quick to drug pricing, the last thing we talk about. And where do we begin here? Maybe we should begin on some interesting data that I don't think people realize, which is which drugs account for most of the costs in our healthcare system. And of course, this is a lot related to FDA and how we approve things, how the Obamacare laws forced the FDA to approve, especially biologic generics called biosimilars, which account for a ton of the drug costs that we see. Approve that in a let's call it a more difficult manner. You could probably expand on that a little bit. Give us maybe my question to you as I ramble on about this subject is give us your overarching view of drug costs, why they are what they are, what is true and what isn't, and maybe what's the right philosophy moving forward to bring drug costs down while also maintaining that innovative edge that really only our country has.
Yeah, look, development costs have gone up enormously. Enrolling a single patient in a clinical trial of a cancer drug could be literally a couple of $100,000, just a single patient. And it used to be back when I was talking about this before I went into FDA, I used to say it's about $100,000. It's doubled probably in the last 5 or 6 years enrolling a single patient in a specialty trial. So that's one problem, is that the input costs have gone up. But the other problem is that in places in the drug market where we do have competition between drugs, oftentimes when you have competition, consumers aren't benefiting from that competition. Sometimes the companies are shielded from actually having to compete with one another in places where they should, where there's multiple drugs available for a given medical condition. And in places where they do compete, where they're actually incentivized to try to lower their costs to get access to formularies and sell their drugs, when there are discounts in the marketplace, those discounts don't come in the form of a reduction in the list price of the drug and what consumers see and what consumers often pay, or at least their copays are tied to. And if you're uninsured, you're paying the full list price of the drug, but they come in the form of rebates that are paid back to the health insurance company that oftentimes are used to offset the cost of health insurance premiums and not offset the cost of the drugs for the patient who's actually receiving them, who might be out of pocket either for part of the cost of the drug or in some cases the full cost of the drug. So you have high costs. Drugs cost a lot because they cost a lot to develop. You have places where there's market failures, where there's not sufficient competition. That touches on your discussion about the biologics, which we can get into, in generic biologics. And then when you have true competition in the marketplace and you have discounting, the discounts don't get applied to the consumers or aren't seen by the consumers and appreciated by the consumers. They're basically collected by the insurance companies.
Yeah, and the stats I was looking for was this. 90% of our drugs are small molecule drugs. So small molecule drugs being, correct me if I'm wrong about this, just jump in anytime, but I'm pretty sure that it means less molecules, literally,
Pills,
which usually means pills, right?
Yeah.
It usually means pills. You can develop generics of these pills rather easily after the patent is done. That's why every time you pick whatever prescription you regularly get, you're usually not getting that brand name that you're familiar with. You're usually getting some other scientific name on your bottle. That's because it's a generic. It's also why it's a lot cheaper. Most of our costs in this country come from the other 10%, these specialty drugs, specialty insulins, biologics, combination products. And that's where it gets difficult. Let's talk about what the Democrats have tried to do. Let's talk about what the ACA did, if you don't mind. On biologics. My understanding of what the ACA did, and I could find in my notes here somewhere exactly what that was called, but maybe you already know. But they one of the ways they were able to get a lot of pharmaceutical companies to buy off on the ACA was by making it more difficult to develop biosimilars. Do you agree with that assessment, or?
Well, the ACA created a pathway. So there was a bipartisan bill to try to create a pathway for basically generic versions of biologics. These are drugs like monoclonal antibodies or protein drugs that oftentimes are injected either subcutaneously or in IV bags. And for a long time, they weren't subject to generic competition. There was a bill to create a pathway for that. It was bipartisan. It got tagged on. It got latched on to the ACA. But that bill was moving through Congress separately, and then ACA became a vehicle to get it ultimately enacted. What the problem with that bill, from my standpoint, is it didn't create a pathway, a very good pathway, to create truly generic versions of drugs that could be used interchangeably, that was substitutable, where the substitution could be made at the point of the pharmacy. The reason why the small molecule generic pills cost so little. So if you go to the store and your doctor writes you for, Lipitor, you're going to get a generic version of Lipitor that's basically pennies per pill. And that's because the pharmacist can take that prescription and they can substitute for the generic drug, for the cheapest generic drug available. So they have substitutability at the point of the pharmacy. With the biologics, they don't have that in place. And the reason it wasn't put in place was because people said at the time, well, it's very hard to say that one biological drug is exactly the same as the other. There might be small differences, and you don't want patients switch from one to the other because there could be some bad health consequences of that. You could develop what we call neutralizing antibodies against the protein, against the drug itself. That might have been true 15 years ago, when we didn't really understand how biologics were manufactured and things that could change with the manufacturing process that may change the characteristics of the drug in very subtle ways. It's not true anymore. And so there should be a pathway to give substitutability, automatic substitutability to protein-based drugs, things like insulin. Insulin's one of the simplest proteins. Patients substitute them all the time, just in the normal course of clinical practice. So why shouldn't it be substitutable at the pharmacy counter? If you had that automatic substitutability, then you'd see the prices come down a lot. You'd have true generic competition in the biologics market. And you probably can't do it with all biologics. Some of them are sufficiently complex where it's impossible to say one is exactly the same as the other.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a lot of biologics where you can say that through pretty simple testing, where you should have that substitutability, and you should be able to give it what we in regulatory speak call an AB rating. An AB rating means that one drug could be substituted for another just by the pharmacist. And there was actually a bill I worked on with a couple of Republican members to create a pathway to give AB ratings to generic insulins.
Well, yeah, we should do. I mean, well, let's shoot me that bill. Let's introduce that, because I was actually gonna move the conversation right to insulin, but you did it for me, because is it technically a biologic, insulin?
Insulin was one of the proteins that was regulated as a drug, but when I was at FDA, we moved it over to the biologics pathway. So for a long time, it was regulated as a drug. We moved it over to the biologics pathway specifically to allow it to avail itself of the biosimilars pathway so that you can have more copies come onto the market.
Did it work, you think, or?
It worked, but again, because they're not true, truly interchangeable insulins, you don't get the true generic pricing.
Yeah, this frustrates.
You have to see more come into the market.
And the insulin's a particular frustrating example, because when you're talking about these advanced therapies and new biologics, you got to understand billions of dollars went into developing that. It's not that surprising that it's going to cost you a lot of money. Because the alternative is what the Democrats do, and they have done this. Unfortunately, it was passed into law. You basically can punish drug companies if they don't take the price that the government wants to give them. Punish them basically out of existence. And so what that's going to do is put a chilling effect on investors investing into those new drug ideas in the first place. The consequences of that can be pretty devastating, but we'll never really know, because we'll just never know what could have existed. But the estimates are there's quite a few drugs that just will never come to market, and between 30 new innovative drugs or hundreds. We really don't know. But the CBO, I think, said at least 30.
Well, I'm already seeing it. I mean, what I'm seeing, so I work on the venture capital side, so I work with some of these startup companies. What I'm seeing is this is definitely impacting investment decisions. So it's not that capital's leaving the space, but where you allocate capital now, you're taking into consideration these new rules. And, sometimes what is an optimal public health outcome isn't necessarily what you're getting as a result of these new rules. So the capital is being allocated based on a consideration of all these government rules. And these government rules aren't necessarily driving the capital into the places where we might say, the best benefits are going to accrue to society. And that's the unfortunate piece of this.
Yeah, no, it certainly is. But, I guess my point was, though, that doesn't really apply to, and insulin is insulin. I'm sure that you can get better insulin. I'm not an expert on how many different kinds of insulin there are. I'm sure it can improve over time. But, this is why Bernie Sanders' obsession with insulin prices and taking busloads of people to Canada to get cheaper insulin, it is effective on the public, because people are like, this stuff has been around forever. Why is it so expensive?
Yeah, look, there are newer insulins on the market that have patent protection, and basically the goal of the newer insulins, what you want to do is you want to get versions of insulins that are going to provide longer coverage. So you just have to take maybe one dose a day and provide a sort of basal, a level of insulin coverage that you're never going to get your blood sugar too high and it's never going to get too low. So that's like the key, trying to keep patients within that narrow band. And you don't want them to become hypoglycemic, meaning their blood sugar gets too low, and you don't want them to become hyperglycemic, meaning their blood sugar gets too high. And newer insulins actually achieve that goal. They're better and better at achieving that goal. But a lot of patients have to supplement the newer insulins with older insulins, to your point, that have been around for a really long time. And when you look at the history of those older insulins, the price went up and up and up and up every year. And, the intellectual property had long lapsed on them, and you didn't see competition coming to the market. You didn't see the prices coming down. So it was a market failure, and it was a market failure born in part of a policy and a regulatory failure. I think there's been steps made to fix it, but not all the steps we could be taking. And that's where I get to the point of allowing the substitutability by the pharmacist. So, you want the innovation on the one side, but when the things for the older products, you want the price competition, and we're not getting the price competition.
All right. Well, I'm glad you gave me that bill. So, I want to take a look at that and get that going, because I've been frustrated by Republicans for not having a really obvious answer to the Democrat price controls, because those price controls are dangerous. They will take the drug that you want 100 years from now. You won't have it. That cure for Alzheimer's, there's a very good chance you won't have it because it won't be worth the investment decisions. To your point about, and this is what I've heard from industry, to your point about where that money will be allocated, it'll be allocated in safer bets, right?
And you won't know what you won't have. That's the
right. You won't know what you won't have. And so this is the gamble the Democrats take by doing this, is they say, well, they know internally we'll never be able to prove what we don't have, right? Because you're trying to prove a counterfactual. And so for them, it's politically a safe bet. Even though it's bad for people and bad for the country in the long term. And that's the frustrating thing about being a conservative and a truth teller to people, I think. That was really helpful, I think, conversation on drug pricing. I've also kept you, I think, for at least an hour now. But I think we got to everything I wanted to get to. We've got to a little bit of FDA reform. We got to some COVID stuff. So I think we got to everything we wanted to get to. Dr. Scott Gottlieb, thank you for your expertise. Thank you for your lifelong work on all of these subjects. And thanks for being on.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for having me.